All right, Javose, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for today's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Semi and Malka Esterson, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak, Laib ben Aharon HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avraham, and Hinda Bas Henech Efraim. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the shurim this week in honor of the birth of a grandson. It's Rabbi Henech Morris, Rosh Kollel of the Columbus Community Kollel, and his wife Chaya, born to their children Isaac and Esther Morris of Baltimore, Mazel Tov. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have a really incredible daf ahead of us today. Really exciting. I also just point out, you'll notice yesterday on the WhatsApp group, I posted just the PDF of Shulchan Aruch. Meretz Hashem. So we are going to be focusing on that a little bit. So hence the earlier start today. Want to focus on some important halacha. So let's begin. So we are picking up, today's daf is 5, but we are picking up on Dalit Amud Beis, and we are picking up about 12 lines up from the bottom. We need 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. It's about 13 lines up from the bottom. Amr Rabbi Yossi, Amr Rabbi Asi, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. We'll say in the wide lines, it is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down in the wide lines. Amr Rabbi Asi, Amr Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to get a little bit of an earlier start just on the daf. So the Gemara, Amr Rabbi Asi, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Also remember again, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah is saying that when do you begin Mashiv Haruach HaMorid HaGeshem? You begin on the last day of Shmini Atzeres, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, the Baal Shachris doesn't say it, and the Baal Musaf does say it. Amar li Rabbi Ziyad Rabbi Asi, Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. Did Rabbi Yochanan actually say that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? Is that really true? But now we learned B'shlosh Shavamar Cheshvan Shol and Esagishamim. Yes, we learned on the 3rd of Cheshvan is when we begin to ask for rain. Rabbi Gamliel or B'shivabo. Rabbi Gamliel says no, not on the 3rd of Cheshvan, but rather on the 7th of Cheshvan. Va'amar Rabbi Lazar halacha Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Lazar said that the halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel. Amar le Gavra Agavra Karamis. Okay, so it could be that Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Asi and Rabbi Yochanan say two different things. In other words, not a contradiction. People could have different opinions. Ibai saying the other possibility is lo kasha kan lishol kan lahaskir. We'll say again, the constant tension in this sugya is whether or not she'ila and haskara are linked, right? So the havamina of the question is based on the premise that she'ila, requesting rain, haskara, which is saying Talmud Libracha, haskara, mentioning rain, Mashiv Racha Merid Agashem, are the same thing, or are actually not the same thing, but are linked. And then the Gemara says, maybe they're not. Maybe they're not. So it could very well be that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda by Mashiv Racha Merid Agashem, namely that you begin it on Shmini Atzeres, and at the same time the halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel, namely that you go ahead and begin the same Talmud Libracha on the 7th of Cheshvan. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan said, B'makom sheshol maskir. So Rabbi Yochanan said, however, Rabbi Yochanan does link she'ila with haskara. And Rabbi Yochanan explicitly says that when you ask is when you remember. Namely, when you say the same Talmud Livracha, that's the time that you also say Mashiv Haruach Morid Agashem. To which the Gemara says, no, hahu lahafsaka itma. But we'll say, here's what's interesting. Everyone is going to agree that haskara, Mashiv Haruach Morid Agashem, and she'ila, the same Talmud Livracha, are linked when? By the cessation of the request. Because we saw this in yesterday's daf. It doesn't make sense to continue one of those without the other. So, for example, once you stop saying the same Talmud Livracha, it doesn't make sense to say Mashiv Haruach Merid Agashem, and vice versa. That's at least the Gemara's premise right now, and vice versa. However, again, when it comes to this beginning, the Gemara already demonstrated. One could make the argument that you could begin saying Mashiv Aruach Morid Gashem when it's the season of rain, even though you're not what? Actually asking for rain. One commit, which is in fact we know what we do. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Avraham Rabbi Yochanan, Hischel Haskir Maschel Lishol, Pasak Milishol, Pasak Milaskir. But Rabbi Yochanan is explicit in saying that when you begin the Haskara, Mashiv Aruach Morid Gashem, is when you should begin the She'ilah. And when you end the She'ilah is when you should end the Haskara. Elo Kasha, rather the Gemara says still it's not a contradiction. Halon, Halahu. One ultimately again is for Bavel and one is for Eretz Yisrael. What's the distinction between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael? Take a look at Rashi. I will say Rashi is in the about 10 lines up from the bottom. Halon v'Halahu libnei Bavel sheish lanu tvua uperos basada. Kol Tishrei, Eid Maskirin at Shiva Maracheshvan, Visham Shoalim, Kida Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Maskela Haske Maskel Lishol. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so the Gemara suggests, in Bavel, produce remains in the field later on. Later on, produce is in the field all of Tishrei. So in Bavel, they do not begin to ask for rain until the 7th of Cheshvan. And the Havmin of the Gemara is 7th of Cheshvan is when you begin the same Talmud Libracha, and 7th of Cheshvan will also be when you begin Mashiv Aruach Morid Gashem. Masha Inkin in Eretz Yisrael is a little bit different. Look at Rashi. V'Halahu Libnei Eretz Yisrael Tikotrin Benisan Va'osrin B'Sheni Maskirin B'Yam Tov Aharon Kreb Yehuda. Darvasi, for those listening to this, but in Eretz Yisrael, where already again they harvest in Nisan, and they're already all the crop is already brought in into the silos by Tishrei, by Sukkot time. So ultimately, again, then they'll begin to say Mashiv Aruach Morid Gashem, and there's no V'Sein Talmud Livracha, but you would say V'Sein Talmud Livracha already again on Shlini Atzeres. So Mashna L'Didan. So why this distinction? Why would there be a distinction between the practices of Eretz Yisrael and Bavel? To the Gemara says Mashna L'Didan the Islon Peri Bedabra, because we'll say ultimately again. In Bavel, it's going to be different because, as we just saw, they'll begin both She'ila and Haskara a little bit later because they still have produce in the field. So the Gemara says, Lidido nami islu ole regalim. But in Eretz Yisrael, there's also a good reason to delay the request for rain. What's the delay for the request of rain? Ultimately, ole regalim. And we'll remember again, after Sukkot, people need to get back home. But see, remember again by Maseches Yuma, remember by Yuma, the tefillah of the Kohen Gadol by the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and what was the last thing the Kohen Gadol said by the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Below tehei tefillas over drachim over lefanecha, or nichnas lefanecha, over lefanecha. Do not let the tefillos of the travelers, right, sway your divine opinion regarding rain. People didn't want rain on the way back. Right, they didn't want rain on the way back. So ultimately, again, in Eretz Yisrael, there's a reason to delay rain as well, the request for rain, because of the Ole Regalim. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi, Islu Ole Regalim, V'im yardu lahem geshamim kashla mechazirasam. If it's raining for the Ole Regalim, it's difficult for them to make their way back home. To which the Gemara says, you're right, Kikam Rabbi Yochanan, Bizman Shein Beis HaMikdash Kayim. Rabbi Yochanan is talking about a time where there is no Beis HaMikdash. To which the Gemara says, well, and therefore again, no issue with Ole Drachim. Well, if that's the case, Hashta da Asis Lahachi Hava Haludido, you could say both opinions are reflective of the practices in Eretz Yisrael. V'lo kasha kan bizman shebeis hamikdash kayim, kan bizman shebeis hamikdash kayim. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says, well, say it's very simple. You could say you could reconcile two opinions as follows. When the Beis HaMikdash is standing and there are Olei Regalim, we won't begin the request for rain until the 7th of Cheshvan. But when there is no Beis HaMikdash, Rahman al-Islan, and there are no Olei Regalim, so ultimately you could begin the request for rain even earlier on. To which the Gemara says, Va'anan, the Islay Treyomi, Hechi Avdinam. So we'll say, now we're transitioning back. So we'll say, let's take a step back for just a moment. The Gemara is operating under the premise of Rabbi Yehuda, namely, that we begin the request, Mashiv Aruach Morid Gashem, when? On what we call Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres. So the Gemara says, well, what do we do in Chutz La'aretz when we have 2 days? So we'll say, remember again, when we have Shmini, when we celebrate Shmini Atzeres, on a technical level, our Shmini is Shmini Safek Shvi'i, right? That's why we sit in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, right? Because it's right, Sveka de Yoma. It might be the 8th day, it might be the 7th day. And then what we call Simchas Torah, which is day 9, is Tishi'i Safek Shmini. Maybe it's the 9th day, maybe it's the 8th day. So now the Gemara asks such a good kasha. So what do we do in Chutz La'aretz in terms of, let's assume we adopt the position of Rabbi Yehuda, namely that we go ahead and we begin Mashi Baruch Amar Dageshem on day number 8 of Sukkot. We'll call it day 8 of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres. What does that mean for us? When is day 8? Is that what we call Shmini Atzeres, which is Shmini Safek Shvi'i? Is it Simchas Torah, which is Tishi Safek Shmini? Which day is it? So listen to this. So the Gemara says, Amarav, this is wild. Amarav, Rav says, Maschil b'musafin. What you should do is you should begin on Musaf, on what we call Shmini Atzeres, which is Shmini Safek Shvi'i. Maybe it's the 8th day, maybe it's the 7th day. So begin Musaf. Get ready for this, Rabbi. Begin Musaf. Posek the mincha, the arvis v'shachris. Then don't say it. Mincha time, Ma'ariv time, and shachris of what we call Simchas Torah, which is Tishi'i Safek Shmini, the Chozer b'Musafin, and then continue again in Musaf of Simchas Torah. We'll say amazing, no? So begin Musaf of what we call Shmini Atzeres, then stop, Mincha, Ma'ariv, Shachris, because again, that might be the 8th day today, and then begin Musaf again on Simchas Torah. So Amru Shmuel. So Shmuel says, Poku, va'amru le'Abba, go out and tell Abba, right? God and tell Rav, Acher sha'asisa kodesh ta'aseu chol. Doesn't make sense, right? Once you begin something in tefillah, literally once you made it sanctified, you're going to make it mundane, which again means it doesn't make any sense. Once you started saying something, then you're going to stop and then reinstitute it later on. Allah Amar Shmuel, rather Shmuel says, Maschil b'musafin u'b'mincha. Rather, we'll say, here's what Shmuel says. Start on what we call Shmini Atzeres, which is Shmini Safek Shvi'i. So start by Musaf, still say it by Mincha, then Posek Arvis V'Shachris. Stop by Ma'ariv and Shachris of what we call Simchas Torah. Because we'll say, what is Shmuel essentially adding? See, what Shmuel is doing is he's saying, listen, once you started it on a particular day, you have to at least what? Finish that day. So if you started it on Shmini Atzeres, you started in Musaf, you got to finish it through Mincha. Fine. I understand what you're doing. You want to hedge your bet a little bit. So you could stop by Ma'ariv and Shachris of what we call Simchas Torah, which is Tishi'i Safek Shmini. That's fine. But Lamais, you have to say for the rest of the day. So the Gemara, listen to this. And then you'll continue, you'll restart it again by Musaf of Simchas Torah, which again is Tishi'i Safek Shmini. Incredible. So we'll say, top of hay. Rava Amar Rava says, no, guys, this does not make any sense. Keva Shehischil, once you started, Shuv Eina Posek. We don't stop. The Chinam Rav Sheshes, Kevan Shehischil, Shuv Eina Posek. And Rav Sheshes said it as well. Once you started, so you'll say, once you're going to start it on what we call Shmini Atzeres. Granted, our Shmini Atzeres Shabbos is what? Again, not anymore, but it was Shmini Safek Shvi'i. Maybe it's day 8, maybe it's day 7, but that's Shmini Atzeres. That's when we will start. And once you start, you do not stop. Shuvena posek. But Rav Hadrabe, even Rav retracted this position. He said, Amarav Chanana, Amarav, Mona Esrim ve'echad yom, Kiderch Shemona Asayim Merashana ad Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur. You count 21 days. 21 days from Rosh Hashanah. The same way I will say that when's Yom Kippur? 10 days after, right from the first day of Rosh Hashanah, you count 21 days. That gives you from Rosh Hashanah. That gives you Shmini Atzeres umaschil, and you begin to say Mashif Haruach Umorid Ageshem v'chayvan shehischil eina posek. And once you start, you do not stop. The Hilchos, this is indeed the halacha. Kayvan shehischil shuv eina posek. Once you start Mashif Haruach Umorid Ageshem on what we call Shmini Atzeres, even though our Shmini Atzeres is Shmini Safek Shvi'i, you do not stop. So I'll say, it turns out that the sugya concludes that the halacha follows Really, again, it's Rabbi Yehuda's position in Rabbi Yoshua. Remember, Rabbi Yoshua is the one in the Mishnah who said that you begin Mashiach Omer Lageshem when? On Shmini Atzeres. On Shmini Atzeres, 8th day. Rabbi Yoshua didn't tell us when. And interestingly enough, from the Gemara, it appears that Rabbi Yoshua's position himself was maybe even to start Shachris of Shmini Atzeres. But Rabbi Yehuda comes along and tells us we begin on Musaf Shmini Atzeres. And even though there's a Sveika Diyoma in Chutz La'aretz about which day is Shmini, which day is Shvi'i, we begin from the day that we treat as Shmini Atzeres, even though it's Shmini Safek Shvi'i, and once you start, you do not stop. Shabbosai, let me draw your attention to the Shulchan Aruch that I sent you in the WhatsApp chat yesterday, just to show you this halacha inside, and we'll close out this sugya. Now, Bosai, the sugya, well, let's take a look. Says the Shulchan Aruch, this is in Siman Kuf Yud Dalid in Arachayim. Maschilin lomar bebracha shniya mashivaruach omori dageshem. We begin to insert mashivaruach omori dageshem in the second bracha of Shmona Esrei. Betfilas musaf shel yom tov ha'acharon shel chag. So that's how we pass halacha l'maisa. We begin to insert mashivaruach omori dageshem by musaf, of Shmini Atzeres. Ve'ein poskin at filas musaf shel yom tov ha'rishon shel Pesach. And when do we conclude? By Musaf of the first day of Pesach. Again, that's why Musaf on the first day of Pesach, we have Tfilas Tal. So that's when we say Mashiach Omer Lageshem. Good. So I will say, so now, of course, the $1 million question, which I alluded to on Sunday, is, I don't understand, if we're beginning Mashiach Omer Lageshem on Shmini Atzeres, the logical time to begin this insertion is when? Is Ma'ariv. Is Ma'ariv of Shmini, like we do every other insertion by Tefillah. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, Sifkat and Beis. The Tchilas Mosaf says in Mishnah Berurah, V'haya roi lahaskil l'ratzos lefnei Hashem miyom tov harishon shel chag, shenidonin bo alamayim. So I'll say, so first of all, the Mishnah Berurah says, in reality, we should have started Mashiach Omer Lageshem really on the first day of Sukkot. Like we started, right? Because that's really Sukkot is the beginning of the rainy season. However, El lefisha gisham simin klala b'chag HaSukkos, but because we don't really want rain during Sukkot, so we'll delay the insertion until Shmini Atzeres. Skip down a little bit. So we'll say, so remember, so now I understand, really I should have started first day Sukkot, but I'm not going to start first day Sukkot because halacha l'maisa, I don't really want rain on Sukkot. Fine. Why not start Ma'ariv on Shmini Atzeres? He says, "El lefisha betfilas arvis ein kala'am bebeis hakneses nimsa ze masker ve'ein ze masker v'yasa agudos." We'll say, what's the concern? Not everybody comes to shul by Ma'ariv. Right. I know this is a time-honored tradition. Right. So we'll say, so not everybody comes to shul by Ma'ariv. So therefore, again, what's the concern? The concern is, you're going to have a situation where that means by Ma'ariv time, some people will be saying Mashiach Baruch, some people won't be saying Mashiach Omer Lageshem, and by Shachris as well. And we'll say, if there's one thing we try to avoid within Klal Yisrael, it's agudos. It's splintered groups. We don't want that. The koach of Klal Yisrael is achdus, is unity, and especially in the realm of tefillah. We don't want some Jews davening this way, some Jews davening that way. We want everybody united in their tefillah. Such an incredible idea. So why not Shachris? V'lamein amaskir b'Shachris. Yeshachas v'neisha asra lahaskir ageshem achiyachros ashatz or sham shmekoram umor ageshem kodem atila. So what's what's the issue? In order to ensure that everybody is saying Mashiach Umor Ageshem, what do you need? You need the Gabbai to announce it for the first time before davening. You can't announce it before Shachris. Why? Because ideally you're not supposed to interrupt between the bracha of Gal Yisrael and Shmona Esrei. So I can't say it Ma'ariv because not everybody is in shul. I can't say, right, and we're going to end up having splintered groups of tefillah. I can't say it Shachris because you're not really supposed to make any announcements between Gal Yisrael and Shmona Esrei. So therefore, again, the first real plausible time that I can insert Mashiach Omer Lageshem and ensure that everybody is unified in their tefillah is going to be Musaf of Shmini Atzeres. Good. So we'll say that's why, by the way, interestingly enough, the Mishnah Berurah says, what happens if you accidentally inserted Mashiach Omer Lageshem on Ma'ariv on Shmini Atzeres or Shachris on Shmini Atzeres? What's the halacha? Interestingly enough, you don't have to go back. Right? Why don't you have to go back? Because technically, it makes sense to start Ma'ariv of Shmini Atzeres. We can't because of certain logistical concerns, as you've seen. But halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we see that if you accidentally inserted it, you don't have to go back. Which I both say, by the way, now you also understand why we don't stop until Musaf of the first day. Same idea of Pesach. You can't stop Ma'ariv because if you stop Ma'ariv, not everybody's in shul. Shachris, so I both say, by stopping Mashiv Baruch Amar Geshem, you have a different issue, which is what? We never announce, it's actually going to be today's daf, we never announce to stop asking for rain. That's an inappropriate thing for a Jew. We never stop. In other words, you can't say, stop asking for bracha. We don't do that. So the way we know to stop saying Mashiv Baruch Amar Geshem is how? Through Tfilas Tal in Chazaras Hashatz. So interestingly enough, in our private Shemona Esrei, we say Mashiv Baruch Amar Geshem. Right? It's only when the Chazan goes ahead and says Tfilas Tal that we know to stop. Good. We'll focus on the cessation of it at a different time, but at least now you know the halacha l'maisa. You saw the sugya of again Mashiv Baruch Amar Geshem on first day of on Shmini Atzeres, 8th day of Sukkot. Good. Mishnah Bosai. Ad Masai Shalom Asagi Shamim. So we'll say, so now this is the back end of that sugya. Until what point in time do we ask for enough? So we'll say, now remember, now we're focusing on the same Tal Umatra Livracha. So when do we go ahead? Actually, I shouldn't say that. But let's just go with the Mishnah's statement right now. Until what point in time do we ask for rain? Yehuda Omer, Ad Shiavor Pesach. Okay, fine. We're going to say Talmud Livracha. Supposed to Yehuda says until Pesach is over. So we'll go ahead and we'll insert the same Talmud Livracha up until the conclusion of Pesach. Rabbi Meir says Ad Sheyetze Nisan. Rabbi Meir says no. We'll continue to ask for rain until the end of Nisan. And the Gemara says Shnei Amar. Vayored lachem geshem umore umalkosh berishon. Right? Because the pasuk says that ultimately HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will bring down for you geshem, more, and malkosh. Again, we'll discuss these are all different types of rain. Berishon, in the first month. In the first month. So you see that halacha l'maisa, it's appropriate for rain to come through the end of the first month, through the end of Nisan. Good. So we'll say fundamental machlokes. Amrli Rav Nachman Rabbi Yitzchak. Yoreh ben Nisan. They say we'll discuss the different types of rain, but Rav Nachman says Rabbi Yitzchak, does Yoreh rain fall down in Nisan? Yoreh marcheshvanu. Yoreh rain, so different types for different seasons. Yoreh rain, Yoreh falls in Marcheshvan. Disnan Yoreh b'Marcheshvan umalkosh ben Nisan. Malkosh rain falls down in Nisan. Amrlei Haki Amr Rabbi Yochanan bimei Yoel ben Pesuel miskayim mikros. What's an incredible Gemara? This normally, you're right. Normally, what we call Yoreh rain, which is a stronger rain, does not fall in Nisan. It falls in Cheshvan. But when did Yoreh rain? And again, the Gemara will define all of these terms. When did Yoreh rain fall in Nisan? It was a miracle which occurred during the times of the Navi Yoel. What happened? Tichsiv Bey Yeser Hagezem Achal Ha'arbe. Because we'll say the Navi talks about a plague of locusts that came, and the locusts devoured everything. Right? Gezem and Arbe are different types of locusts. Whatever the Gezem left over, the Arbe devoured. Osa Shana, so that particular year, Osa Shana, Yatsa Adar Velo Yardu Gishamim. Well, so just to give you the context, this was a famine that was decreed during the days of Yehoram, who was the son of Achav. Right, so it was not a dramatic, but a devastating famine that was decreed upon Am Yisrael because of their worship of Avodah Zarah. So everything was decimated. Everything was decimated. So then they did tshuva. So the Navi says as follows. So Osa Shana Yatsa Adar Lo Yardu Gisham. So we'll say that year Adar had passed and it still had not rained. So we'll say, so understand what that means. Rain, the first rains are supposed to come in Cheshvan. So already, again, we're up to Adar, and there was not one rainfall. So what happened? Amar lahem Navi the Yisrael. So the Navi Yoel said to them, Su'u v'zaru. Go ahead and take whatever remaining wheat you have and plant it. Amr lo, mish yish lo kavchitim, o kabayim se'orim, yochlenu v'yichya, o yizar enu v'yamos. So the people said to Yoel, that doesn't make any sense. We have very little wheat left. So we have a choice. We could plant it, and then we'll mamish have nothing to eat. Or at least we could have it to eat and hopefully find other ways to survive. In other words, by telling us to plant our remaining wheat, you are affected. It's a death sentence. It's a death sentence. Amar lahem afa pikein su v'zaru. So you all said, no, listen to me. Take your remaining wheat and go ahead and plant it. Na'aseh lohem nes. So the Gemara says a miracle occurred. What was the miracle? V'neskala lohem mashe b'ksolin or mashe b'chorei nimalim. They found wheat hidden in the walls, and they found. So what's the wheat hidden in the walls? It was wheat stored by mice. They found wheat hidden in the walls, and they found wheat hidden in ant holes. Yatsu v'zaru. So they went ahead and they took their remaining wheat. So they had a little bit left to eat. They took their remaining wheat and they planted it. Sheni ushlishi urevi'i v'yardolahem revia shnia. So we'll say, so what happens? Remember, when is this occurring? This is all occurring on the 1st of Nisan. On the 1st of Nisan. So they're planting their wheat on the 1st of Nisan. Sheni ushlishi urevi'i v'yardolahem revia shnia b'chamishi. So then the 2nd day of Nisan went by, 3rd day, 4th day, and then ultimately again it rained again on the 5th day of Nisan. So they plant on the 1st, it rains again on the 5th day of Nisan. Hekrivu Omer b'shisha asher Nisan. And they offered up the Omer on the 16th of Nisan. Right? So it's the 2nd day Pesach. So once you understand what happened over here, they planted on the 1st day of Nisan. And ultimately, again, they're already offering up the Omer on the 16th day of Nisan. Hegdila b'shisha chadashim. I'm sorry. So Nimseis. It turns out that Tfua hagedela b'shisha chadashim gedela ba'achad asar yom. It turned out that wheat, which would normally take 6 months to grow, had effectively grown in 11 days. In 11 days. Nimtza omer akarev mitvua shal shisha chadashim karev mitvua shal achades hayom. So an omer, which normally comes from barley, which takes 6 months to grow, now came from barley, which took 11 days to grow. Va'al oso hadarhu omer, and about that generation it is said, hazorim bedima barina yiktzoru. Both say so beautiful in Shem Alas. Right? So what do we say? Hazorim bedima. Those who sow, those who plant with seeds, will go ahead and harvest with joy. Planted with tears. They planted with tears, we'll say, because remember, they were devastated about having to take their remaining food supply and plant it. So they planted with tears, but ultimately, again, they harvested with incredible joy the bounty that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given them. What does it mean? Haloch yelech uvacho no se meshech hazara. So what about the next phrase? Haloch yelech uvacho, which literally means he goes and he comes and is crying. No se meshech hazara. He carries the container of seeds. What is that referring to? My haloch yelech ubacho. No se meshech. What does that mean? But listen to this. It's not referring to people. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, shar kishu choresh holech ubocha. You know, the shar, the ox, when it was plowing, would cry. Right? Why do people say, the halacha is lo sachsam shar b'disho. You're not permitted to muzzle your ox when it plows. Why not? Because the ox should be able to eat while it's plowing. Now let's muzzle it. So the ox, haloch yelech uvacho. The ox, as it was plowing, it was crying. Why was it crying? There was nothing to eat. Ubechaziraso ochel chaziz min hatelem. But amazingly enough, the same ox, when it was plowing, when it was going by the first time, ultimately again nothing to eat. As it was coming back, already again, ochel chaziz min hatelem, it ate the sprouted greens from the furrows. So, in other words, by the time it was already making its way back along the field, already things had begun to sprout, and already the ox had what to eat. V'zeh bo yavo verina. And that's why it says when it comes back with celebration, referring to the ox. My nose alumosov. What does the phrase mean? Literally, both say nose alumosov means carrying the sheaves. What does that mean? Kana zeres. Shibolas Zerasayim. What it means is, in that generation, this miracle by the Navi Yoel, there was such incredible growth that each stalk was the size of a hand, and each ear was two hand widths or 2 hand spans. Amar li Rabbi Nachman Rabbi Yitzchak, my dechsiv, ki kara Hashem l'rav v'gamba el eretz sheva. I'm sorry, quoting over here the pasuk from Malachim Beis. Kikara Hashem l'rav, Chadosh Baruch Hu called for a famine. V'gamba el haaretz sheva shanim, and the famine will come to the land for 7 years. So b'hanach shevach shanim ma'achal. What did the people eat during those 7-year famine? What do you eat during a 7-year famine? So it says the Gemara, Amar lehacha Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shana Rishona achlu ma shebebatim. The first year they ate what was in the homes. Shnia achlu ma shebesados. The second year they ate that which was in the field. Shlish is basar behema Torah. Third year they ate their livestock. Berevius basar behema tchamishis. I'm sorry, basar behema tmeya. The fourth year they ate non-kosher animals. Chamishis basar shkatzim b'ramasim. Fifth year they ate again, creepy crawly things. Shishis basar b'nei menoseim. Nebuch again in the 6th year they ate their children. Shvius basar zuraosehem. The 7th year, ultimately, again, literally, they ate their arms. So again, the Mepharshim point out this idea that, remember, this was not normal famine, right? In other words, people have, unfortunately, famine is a reality of the human condition, right? What they're describing over here is something even more dramatic, symptomatic of the terrible spiritual decline of the Jewish people during this time. The Kaim Mashnemar, Ish Basar Zira'o Yochelu. So again, just pointing out over here that remember how this whole discussion started, right? The Gemara said, the Gemara quoted the pasuk that said that Yoreh comes in Nisan, to which the Gemara says, when does Yoreh ever come in Nisan? Yoreh is the type of rain that comes in Cheshvan, to which the Gemara said, you're right, one time Yoreh came in Nisan. When was it? During the times of the Navi Yoel, the incredible miracle that came to end the 7 years of famine, where a grain that would normally take 6 years to grow was produced ultimately again in 15 days. Incredible. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk, is so incredible. Quotes the pasuk from Hosea. So the Gemara says, "Bikir becha kadosh v'lo aval ba'ir." So we'll say, so literally translated, what this means is Bikir becha kadosh. When inside of you is sanctified, for the avol ba'ir, I will not come into the city. So what does that mean? So b'kir b'cha kadosh la'avol ba'ir, mishum de b'kir b'cha kadosh la'avol ba'ir, because you're holy on the inside, I won't come into the city. This is HaKohen Baruch Hu talking. I was supposed to say that doesn't make sense. If anything, if I'm holy on the inside, HaKohen Baruch Hu certainly should join me in the city. But isn't that beautiful? This is. So Rabbi Yochanan says, HaKohen Baruch Hu Shalom said, Lo avo b'Yerushalayim shalmala ad she'avo l'Yerushalayim shalmata. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu says is, I will not reside in the celestial Yerushalayim until the earthly Yerushalayim is rebuilt. So we'll say that is the promise that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives to us. I will not rest in my celestial Yerushalayim until your earthly Yerushalayim is rebuilt. Lo avo b'kir b'cha kadosh v'lo avo. Ultimately, again, only, right? It's only once your Yerushalayim is rebuilt that I will come back to my Yerushalayim. We'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Lo avu b'Yerushalayim. We'll say it's 5 lines up from the bottom. V'hachi kamer. This is what the pasuk means to say. This is what it means to say. Ad she'yehei b'kir becha kadosh lamata. Until you are kadosh, meaning Yerushalayim shalmata. Yerushalayim of this world is kadosh. Dahainu Yerushalayim lo avu b'ir shalamala. I will not go to my Yerushalayim ultimately until your Yerushalayim is intact and holy. To which the Gemara says, Umi iko Yerushalayim lamala. Is there a celestial Yerushalayim? Is Yerushalayim and Shamayim in? Let's listen to this, how beautiful this is. Dichsev, Yerushalayim habenuya ki'ir shechubra la yachtav. Yerushalayim, ultimately, the rebuilt Yerushalayim, ki'ir shechubra la yachtav. We'll say the Gemara is translating over here. Look at Rashi. Yerushalayim habenuya ki'ir shechubra la yachtav. Yerushalayim shalamata Te benuya ke'ir shechubra la shehi kiyotze b'chaverta v'dugmasa. So we'll say, into the way the Gemara is dashing the pasuk over here is ke'ir shechubra la Yerushalayim habenuya, Yerushalayim that is rebuilt in this world. Ke'ir shechubra la is like the city which is connected to it. Which is the city connected to Yerushalayim? That is the celestial Yerushalayim that is connected to the earthly Yerushalayim. We'll say what an incredible and beautiful and overwhelming idea. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has Yerushalayim in Shamayim, and we have a Yerushalayim in this world. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises that He will not set up permanent residence in His celestial Yerushalayim until our Yerushalayim is rebuilt and intact. Quite incredible. So I'll say, so the truth is that Tosfos has a different interpretation of this, but we'll leave this for now. We'll say truly, absolutely, by the way, you see the power and the beauty and the holiness of the city of Yerushalayim, that it's so intense and it's so incredible that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has his own Yerushalayim as well. There's Yerushalayim Shalmata and the Yerushalayim Shalmata. Now, by the way, this of course also fits into the narrative that we saw in Masechus Rosh Hashanah, namely, remember again, we saw by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai about he decreed that the Yom Hanef, the second day of Sukkot, second day of Pesach, he can't eat Chadash the entire time, because what is he concerned about? Mehira Yibana HaMikdash. And remember again, Rashi pointed out, Gemara pointed out, that in the third base Hamikdash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to have the opinion that how is it going to come down? How is the third base going to come down? Fully intact. So if you understand this imagery of a celestial Yerushalayim and an earthly Yerushalayim, the third base Hamikdash Keviyachol comes down from the Yerushalayim Shalmala, and it comes down right and is situated into Yerushalayim Shalmata. Halavai, we should be Zocheh Meretz Hashem to see it with our own eyes. Mihira B'yameinu. Shavuot say, let's go weiter. Umika Yerushalayim, yes, good. V'amli Ramnachan Rabbi Yitzchak, Mai Dichsev. What's the meaning of the pasuk? Uba'achos yivaru v'yikaslu musar havalim. Shavuot say here now the Gemara quotes from the pasuk. Quotes from the pasuk in, quotes from the pasuk in Yirmiyah. Uba'achas yivaru v'yikaslu musar havalim eitzu. What does this refer to? Amar lihach Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Achas hi shemeva'eres v'shem shebegehenna. There is one sin which causes the Rishaim to burn in Gehenna. Ma'hi, what is it? Avodah Zarah. So Avodah Zarah is the sin which causes the Rishaim to burn in Gehenna. Ksiv hacha, it says over here, Musar havalim eitzu. It says here again that this Musar of folly is wood. Ksiv hasam, hevel hema maase tatuim. Ultimately, again, hevel maase tatuim, which literally means nothingness, is the creations of their delusions. What does it mean when it says, my nation has committed two evils against me? That's it. But we're in pretty good shape, right? If we've only committed two evils against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's fantastic, right? Only two, to which the Gemara says, Esrin v'arba shivikalahu. Ultimately, again, the Gemara recounts 24 averos that we committed against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So why did the pasuk only say two? Amar Rabbi Yochanan. This is what Rabbi Yochanan meant to say. Achos, one avera, amadeis, shehishkula kishtayim. One avera that's like two averas. And what's the one avera that's like two averas? Umaynihu avodah zarah, idolatry. Dichsev, what's the second line? Hey amadeis. Dichsev, kishtayim ra'os asa ami. There are two evils that my nation has committed. Osi azvu makar chayim. So what's here? The Gemara is quoting the pasuk from Yirmiyahu. So I'm just with you. Kishtayim ra'os asa ami. My nation committed two evils. So azvu makar chayim, makar mayim chayim. They have left, literally again, the source, makar mayim chayim, the source of living waters. Lachsov lahem boros nishpaim asher lo yachilu hamayim. To dig for themselves broken cisterns that will not yield any water. Uksiv bahu, and it says, Uksiv bahu ki avru iye kitim v'ra'u kedar. Because we'll say the pasuk then says once again by Yirmiyahu ki ivru iye kitim, which literally means they have gone ahead and passed over the ayim of the islands of the Kitim uru'u kedar. So what does this mean? Shalchu v'sponu ma'od hayiyomer goy elokim vehema lo Elohehem va'ami hemir kvodo below yoel. So this is actually quite interesting. So the Gemara says, the Gemara quotes this pasuk from Yirmiyahu and is comparing the Jews to the nations of the world. How so? Tana kusim ovdim laish. The kusim, they worship fire. Ukedarim over lamayim. The kedarim, they worship the water. And even though everyone knows that the water extinguishes the fire, lo hemiru Eloheim. So we'll say this is incredible. Listen to this. See, the kusim, they worship the water, right? And And the okay, so the Kusim, they go ahead and they worship the fire. Sorry, and the Kedarim, they worship the water. Now, what's the interesting part? The interesting part of this is the Kusim know that water extinguishes fire. Yet what? They still maintain a fidelity and allegiance to their God. So we'll say, here's something amazing. And even though they know that the water extinguishes the fire, still the Kusim still don't forsake their God. Shabbosai, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what? I respect that. I respect that. You know what? You make a choice, you choose a team, and you honor your commitment to your team. I absolutely respect that. Va'ami, on the other hand, va'ami hemir kvodi below yoel. My nation, they forsake me, and she will say, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu admire, this goes back to what we said yesterday and the day before. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks for is commitment and consistency. If you're committed, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not really being as much consistency, it's commitment. So sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at the Ovdei Avodah Zarah and he says, wow, it's so clear that their Avodah is not real, right? It's so clear that fire can't be the God, because fire can be extinguished by water, right? This goes back to Avraham Avinu when he smashed all of the idols in Terach's shop. It is so clear that Avodah Zarah is false, yet its worshippers are so committed to it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, that's incredible. My nation, often they're not committed to me, and they're willing to exchange me for anything and everything else which suits their purpose. I will say, it's almost as in the pasuk, you hear the hurt of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? How could it be that Avodah Zarah has such committed adherence, and yet sometimes my own people, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, lack that level of commitment? It's such a profound musar, which I will say, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to us is, I don't need you to be perfect. I don't even need you to be great. I just need you to be committed. And I will say, commitment doesn't mean I get it right all the time. And commitment doesn't mean that I don't sin. Commitment just means, I will say the same way, I'm committed to my wife. Does that mean I never make mistakes? Every day. Every single day. Multiple times each day. And they're categorized and they're alphabetized, right? And they're ranked, right? From less severe to most severe. But I will say, amazingly enough, those mistakes don't mean that I'm not committed. I'm 1,000% committed. I'm 1,000,000% committed. I'm all in. And that commitment, I want to point out, in all seriousness, in a marriage, that commitment is what allows you to rebuild after mistakes, right? Because each party knows we're both committed. Okay, we made mistakes. Let's fix this. But we're both fully committed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says what's often lacking in our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that all-in sense of commitment. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu admires the fact that it exists by the Umos Ha'olam, it exists by the idolaters, but sometimes it doesn't exist by Klal Yisrael. It's pretty profound. Yitzchak. Mind the Amr, what does it mean when it says, it's an incredible Gemara. Vahi kasher zakin Shmuel. Pasuk says, Shmuel got old. Umi sib Shmuel kolehai. But was Shmuel really that old? So the Gemara says, Vaha bar nun beis shana hava. But says Shmuel was only 52 years old when he died. Shmuel was only 52 when he died. The Amar Meis benun beis shana zemi says Shmuel. Shmuel died when he was 52 years old. So I'm sorry, Misal Shmuel Ramasi. Amar lehachi Amar. So let's listen to this. So what does it mean? What does it mean when it says? What does it mean when it says that Shmuel died old? Vahi kasha zakin Shmuel. Let's listen to this. Amar lehachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan zikna kafza alav. It means that Shmuel aged prematurely. He got very old, very young. So we'll say now what happened? Now here's what's interesting. The Gemara quotes this idea in Shabbos. You can see Mr. quotes it in Shabbos of Zikna Kafza Alav. There in the Gemara Masechet Shabbos, the Maharsha comments, and the Maharsha says there's a good reason why Zikna Kafza Alav, because the yoke of leadership does that to a person. When a person assumes the mantle of leadership, it ages them. So it's not a miracle. That Shmuel aged prematurely. It's a metzius that Shmuel aged prematurely. That level, and remember again, think about also the level of responsibility that Shmuel had on his shoulders. Under Shmuel, they transitioned from the shoftim to malachim, from a shofet to a king. I mean, they still had a shofet, but they went from a shofet model to a king model. So the Gemara Masech Shabbos indicates that Shmuel aged prematurely because of the awesome responsibility which rested on his shoulders. The Gemara here has a different interpretation. Watch this. What happened to Shmuel that caused him to age prematurely? So says the Gemara, because the pasuk says, the Kislev, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, Nichamti ki imlachti Shaul. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm very upset that I allowed Shaul to be king. Right? In the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shaul's monarchy was a failed monarchy. So what happened? Amr the father of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is ready to take the life of Shaul. So Shmuel says, Amr the father of Ribono Shel Olam, Shekal Sani Ki Moshe Aharon. So Shmuel says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you told me that I am as great as Moshe and Aaron. B'chsiv, Moshe ve'Aaron b'kohanov, u'Shmuel b'korei Shemo. So Shmuel Hanavi says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, you told me that I am as great and as important and as holy as Moshe and Aaron, but yet by Moshe and Aaron, the TALMUD of Aharon. So Moshe and Aaron, they were privileged to see their student outlive them. Af ani lo yispatel maaseh yadi b'chayai. So Shmuel says, I can't bear to see my creation, my Talmud, Shaul predecease me. I can't bear to see that. Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Simone Julie says, well, what should I do? HaKohen HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what are my options here? Lemos Shaul lo kashavik Shmuel. To take the life of Shaul, Shmuel will not permit that. I will say, you hear these words? You hear the power of a tzaddik? Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I would take the life of Shaul, but I can't because Shmuel will not let it. That's the power of the tefillah of a tzaddik. So the Gemara says, Lema Shmuel, if I cause Shmuel to die now, so maybe Shmuel has to die in order that the monarchy of Shaul could come to an end. Ad zutar miranani abasrei. So I will say, if I take Shmuel at a young age, people will associate his premature death with some type of sin, and I can't be motzi las. I can't allow such lashon hara to be spoken about my beloved prophet. So lo lema Shaul, lo lema Shmuel. So let's say I let both Shmuel and Shaul live. That doesn't work. Kivar higia malchus David, vein malchus nogea bechaver tafilu kimalinema. It is already time for David's monarchy, and one monarchy cannot overlap with another monarchy, even a hair's breadth. So what should I do? Akpitz alav zikna. I will cause Shmuel to age prematurely, so that he will look like a very old man. He will die, and people will just assume that he died of old age. So we'll say that's why it's Vahiki Zakin Shmuel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused Shmuel to age prematurely, so that he would look like an old man. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu could take Shmuel's life. Why did he take Shmuel's life? To be able to honor the request of Shmuel. The request of Shmuel, namely, to not go ahead and have Shaul predecease him. The Gemara says, B'Shaul Yoshev B'Giva, or I should say, actually, we'll see. B'Shaul Yoshev B'Giva, Tachas HaEshel B'Rama. Shaul was sitting, I will say, listen to this pasuk. Shaul was sitting in the Giva, Tachas Eshel B'Rama. So I will say, the Giva, Rashi says over here, well, let me finish the Gemara. But I will say, ultimately, again, what is Giva doing by Ramah? I will say, these are two different geographic areas, right? Ultimately, again, Giva was an area in the tribal area of Binyamin. Ramah was in Efraim. So what does it mean that Shaul is sitting in the Giva, in the Shevet of Ephraim, right, in the area of Ephraim, by the Ramah, in the area of Binyamin, by the Ramah of Ephraim, what allowed Shaul to go ahead and dwell in the Giva 2.5 years? We'll say Shaul was king for 2.5 years. What allowed for that? Tefillah shel Shmuel haramasi. Ultimately, again, it was the tefillah of Shmuel. That ultimately, again, if it was up to HaKadosh, the Ribbon Shalom would have taken Shaul's life earlier, but it was the tefillah of Shmuel which gave Shaul a bit of longevity. So the Gemara says, "Umi madchi gavra mikame gavra." Now, both say, now listen to this. So the Gemara says something fascinating. Both say, if you look at this discussion, essentially what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says is, someone's got to die. Someone's got to die. Why does someone have to die? Because it is time for David to become king, and one monarchy cannot overlap with another monarchy. So something's got to give over here. So the Gemara says, is that how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world? That literally one person's agenda pushes another person aside. Now again, it's not David's agenda, it's God's agenda for David. But this notion that it's time for David to reign, and therefore again, other people have to be pushed off the stage. Shmuel has to, well, not as much Shmuel, but Shaul has to be pushed off. Does HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually run the world this way? So the Gemara says, yes, Damar Shua Barachmani, Amar Shua Barachmani, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my Damar, Alkin Chatzavti Benevim, Haraktim Ba'amrefi, Ma'asim Lo Ne'amar, Ela Be'imrefi. So let's do this. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says as follows, I have, Chatzavti means carved out. I have carved out by the prophets. Haraktim Be'imrefi. I have killed them with the word of my mouth. It doesn't say B'ma'aseyem. It doesn't say ultimately, again, as a result of their sin, Ela Be'imrefi, which means ultimately, I'm going to say this, sometimes people die because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Gezerah, which I will say tells you something amazing. Sometimes things happen to us not because of us, but because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to set the stage for other things to occur, which is an incredibly humbling experience, humbling idea. In other words, we don't exist in a vacuum, and our lives don't exist in a vacuum, and sometimes we are part of a much larger picture. And because of that, sometimes there are circumstances in my life that occur because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is setting the stage for something else to unfold. So I will say, you see this, by the way, in the stories of Tanakh all of the time, where people are caught up in circumstances not of their own choosing or not of their own doing, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is setting the stage for something else. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu literally says to Shmuel, it's time for David to reign. Shaul has to be removed from the picture because one monarchy cannot overlap with another monarchy, even a hair's breadth, right? It just cannot happen. So therefore, I will say, so the Gemara says, yes. So this is what's called mitchi gavra mikame gavra. One person is set aside in order to go ahead and make room for another. I will say, again, it's a very humbling yesod, but it highlights the idea that we do not exist in a vacuum. We are all cogs in the wheel. Our individualistic identities are incredibly important, but at the end of the day, sometimes there are circumstances in life that I am impacted by that don't even have as much to do with me as much as they have to set the stage for something bigger and better to occur. Incredible. Rav Nachman listen to this incredible Gemara. Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yitzchak were sitting down to a Suda together. Amar li Rav Nachman Rabbi Yitzchak. Rav Nachman said to Rabbi Yitzchak, "No, Lema Mar Milsa. Tell me a Dvar Torah." Rav Nachman said, "Tell me a good vart." Amar le. So Rav Nachman says back to him. I'm sorry. Rabbi Yitzchak says back to him. Amar le. Hachim Rabbi Yochanan. His Rabbi Yochanan said, "Ein masich in besud." You want to hear a good vart? The vart is we don't talk during the meal. Why? Shema yaktim kana levesha. Because perhaps the windpipe will come in front of the esophagus and cause a person to choke. Right? That's my Dvar Torah. Right? You could both say you could use this one. Right? If you ever put on the spot, right? You always have that awkward, right? You say Dvar Torah and you weren't listening during Shir, right? So you don't have a Dvar Torah. This is always a good one. I would love to, but Chazal said you shouldn't, right? Chazal said it's a choking hazard. So the Gemara says, so after the Suda, so ultimately again, after the Suda, Rabbi Yitzchak said as follows. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Yaakov Avinu lo meis. So I'll tell you a good vart. What's the vart? Yaakov Avinu did not die. That's the vart. Yaakov Avinu never died. Amrle, he said to him, Yaakov Avinu never died. Amrle, v'chi b'chtei saftu sabdaino, v'chantu chantaya, v'kavru kavarya. That's interesting because they eulogized Yaakov and they embalmed Yaakov and they buried Yaakov. So what do you mean that Yaakov Avinu didn't die? Amrle, Mikra ani dorish. I'm dashing a pasuk. Shnei Amar v'ato al tira avdi Yaakov nu'um Hashem. And you, because we're over here quoting the pasuk from Yirmiyah. V'ato al tira avdi Yaakov. Do not fear my servant Yaakov. Nu'um Hashem v'atachas Yisrael ki hineni moshiacha mirachok. So v'az daracham me'eretz shivyam makish hu lezaro. So the pasuk compares Yaakov Avinu to his offspring. Mazaro b'chayim. Just like his offspring are alive, af hu b'chayim. So too Yaakov Avinu is alive. So Rabbi say this idea, right? We're familiar with this Gemara, but what does it mean that Yaakov Avinu is still alive? Rabbi say, how do you understand this? Okay, so the truth is, this is a sentiment you often hear expressed at a levaya, right? So obviously the Gemara is not highlighting the idea that Yaakov Avinu is physically alive, his memory is alive, his life lessons are alive. But what does it mean that Yaakov Avinu lo meis? I'll share with you, with this we'll have to conclude, I'll share with you an incredible idea that's brought down by the Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes says, listen to these words. Kol adam bali olam bichdei livtsoa ez shlichus. So Sfas Emes says, the Rebbe says, every person comes into this world for a shlichus. For an say, see, people think that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik v'Kadosh Levracha, was the first one who came up with the idea of a shlichus. Right? It's not true. Right? Shlichus is part of the essence of Klal Yisrael from time immemorial. Right? Every person comes into this world with a shlichus. And what happens when you finish your shlichus? What happens when you finish your shlichus? Life comes to an end. That's it. Finish your shlichus, life is over. Yaakov Avinu, supposed to listen to this. I'll tell you the rest of this outside. Yaakov Avinu was the first person to ever show us that a person could have more than one shlichus in life. Isn't this incredible? And where did Yaakov Avinu show this to us? Through the transition, actually, I'll say, this week's parasha. What happens in this week's parasha? Vayivaser Yaakov levado, vayiavik ishim. Yaakov Avinu is alone at night, and he struggles with the mysterious ish, the mysterious man. And he fights the whole night. And sun comes up, he's still standing. He's injured, but he's still standing. And what happens in that moment? What happens? Ultimately, again, Yaakov Avinu's name is changed from Yaakov to Yisrael. Kisarisa imanashim imelokim vanashim batuchal. So says the Sfas Emes something amazing. What happens in this week's parsha when there is a name change? Yaakov Avinu gets a new shlichus. He gets a new shlichus, a new life mission. His first mission was a mission as an individual, and now his new mission, his new shlichus, Yisrael, Yaakov is an individual identity, Yisrael is a national identity. His shlichus changes. Says the Sfas Emes, Yaakov Avinu is the first person who taught us the concept that you could have more than one shlichus in life. And therefore, says the Sfas Emes, so this is up to conclude, that this is the meaning of the Gemara. What does Yaakov Avinu lo meis? Yaakov Avinu didn't die. That again, Yaakov Avinu taught us that halacha l'maisa, when one shlichus comes to an end, that doesn't have to be the end of the road for you. There could be an additional shlichus. There could be an additional agency. There could be an additional life mission. So many times in life, we begin a shlichus, and the shlichus doesn't work out. And we think for ourselves that this is the end of the road. But it's not true. Yaakov Avinu teaches us there could be more than one shlichus in existence. There could be more than one purpose in life. There could be more than one mission. And even when one thing comes to an end, either because you finish the shlichus, or it comes to a grinding halt because of circumstances beyond your control, just because you've come to the end of the road doesn't mean that there's not another shlichus waiting for you. Sometimes when we start something and we end, and it comes to an abrupt halt, we think, Misa, it's the end of the road. Yaakov Avinu lo meis. Just like when Yaakov ceases to exist, but Yisrael begins, it's a new shlichus, a brand new chapter of life. So too, even when one shlichus ends, another one always begins. We'll stop over here for today. We'll continue with this Gemara tomorrow. Shkayach everyone.